Skin and soft tissue infections have a wide range of presentations, from simple cellulitis here to necrotizing fasciitis here. Both of these diagnoses are on different ends of the spectrum of the same situation, where you have bacterial infection of the skin. Today we're going to be talking about skin and soft tissue infections, or SSTIs. I've got 6 things I'd like to talk about with you today, so let's get started with number 1, terminology. When we describe most skin and soft tissue infections, one of the most important branch points for the treatment of the infection is to determine if the infection is purulent versus non-purulent. Although this is clearly a dental infection, it is an awesome example of a purulent infection. Sometimes it's obvious when you look at an infection if there's purulence, like this one where you can actually see pus, but sometimes it's not that obvious. Sometimes it's actually not obvious. Some people may think that this is non-purulent cellulitis, but they'd be wrong. There's actually an abscess under there, which requires different treatment, and if antibiotics are given, antibiotics that cover different bacteria. So how can you differentiate purulent versus non-purulent infections if it's not clear in physical exam? Well, of course, I'm going to advocate for point-of-care ultrasound. There are a ton of articles that say that you should do it, so if there's any question of purulence, just perform the ultrasound. And why does it matter? Well, look at the clip on the left. This is a hypoechoic fluid collection that is consistent with an abscess. This is a purulent infection typically caused by staph such as MRSA. Compared to the clip on the right, which has these cobblestoning of the subcutaneous fat lobules, this is a non-purulent infection typically caused by strep such as group A strep, and no MRSA coverage is needed. But before we move on to the next section, I want to talk about how often we're wrong about the diagnosis of cellulitis. There is a phenomenon called pseudocellulitis. This is when someone diagnoses bilateral lower extremity cellulitis. This is not bilateral lower extremity cellulitis, but rather stasis dermatitis, or a more advanced form, lipodermatosclerosis. This has the appearance of an inverted champagne bottle. However, DVT, gout, allergic reactions, etc. can all create similar findings of cellulitis. Make sure not to diagnose bilateral lower extremity cellulitis. There's another term you should be familiar with called erysipelas. It's a more superficial skin infection with clear demarcation. The differentiation between cellulitis and erysipelas isn't really important. You treat them both the same. Another important term is impetigo. This is usually seen in kids with localized vesicular eruptions, typically on the face, with golden or honey crust, and you only need to treat this with topical antibiotics such as mupirocin. A quick aside on marking or outlining your cellulitis. I used to do this, but I don't do it anymore. Almost always, the redness is going to get worse temporarily before it gets better, and the patient gets very concerned or returns to the emergency department inappropriately. So I recommend, if you want to mark your cellulitis, let the patient know that there may be temporary spread outside of the lines, but it should be inside the lines by the 48 to 72 hour mark. Moving on to the second topic to discuss, diagnosis and workup. We've already talked about point-of-care ultrasound for purulence, but do you need any labs to make the diagnosis of cellulitis? You do not. The diagnosis is clinical. No blood cultures are needed unless you're septic. Only 5% of blood cultures are positive, and they rarely change management. In fact, the IDSA has come out and recommended against obtaining routine blood cultures even if you're admitted. And don't get me started on CT scans. I have no clue why so many docs are ordering CT scans for routine skin and soft tissue infections. They are not good for superficial abscesses. Moving on to the third topic to discuss, antibiotic selection. Well, if you have a purulent infection, we've already mentioned that this is probably staph such as MRSA, so you have 3 oral options, including doxycycline, trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, or clindamycin. There is a 4th option, vancomycin, if you're admitted. If you have a non-purulent cellulitis, it's typically strep and no MRSA coverage is needed. The big treatment option is cephalexin, a first-generation cephalosporin that's dosed every 6 hours. However, that is a difficult way to take antibiotics, so another great option is cefadroxil, which is dosed BID. This is preferred at our hospital. How long should you treat your skin and soft tissue infection for? Well, I can tell you it's 5 to 6 days. The IDSA came out in 2014 and said 5 days. Other studies looked at it and said 6 days, so somewhere between 5 and 6 days. And what I do, I give the first dose of oral antibiotics in the emergency department, since it can take a long time for the patient to get antibiotics from the pharmacy, and so now you're giving 5.5 days right in the middle. All of the oral antibiotics I mentioned on the last slide have excellent bioavailability, over 90%. So if a patient is requesting a dose of an IV antibiotic, I tell the patient that they're getting an equivalent of an IV antibiotic in a pill form. Here's the antibiotic susceptibility at our hospital. It's important to look up your own sensitivity since it may be different at your hospital, so ask your friendly ED pharmacist for the antibiogram and look up MRSA and strep sensitivities. You'll notice doxycycline and trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole are both pretty good, and clindamycin is a distant third for MRSA, whereas if you're giving IV antibiotics, both vancomycin and linezolid are excellent. If you move on to the strep sensitivities, penicillin is still excellent, and clindamycin is still a distant second. Vancomycin and linezolid are still both excellent here. One thing that I wish I learned earlier in my medical career was the difference between community-acquired and hospital-acquired MRSA. In my lecture, I'm generally talking about community-acquired MRSA, but if you get the MRSA acquired in a hospital, it is going to be much more resistant and typically needs vancomycin or linezolid. So if you haven't learned anything yet, listen up because I bet this one's new. There's a somewhat new outpatient treatment for cellulitis with linezolid. So if a patient has failed outpatient treatment, meaning they've had 48 to 72 hours of a typical antibiotic and they're not getting better, there is a new antibiotic that's generic that you can use, and that is linezolid. This will destroy any gram-positive bacteria, so essentially an IV vancomycin in an oral form. Now, there's a couple things to remember. It is generic now, so it does cost less than $50, which may be a problem for some of your patients, but I'd rather accept this than laying in a hospital bed for a few days getting IV vancomycin. You also have to know that there's a risk of serotonin syndrome and thrombocytopenia. What if your patient has the dreaded penicillin allergy? Can you still give them penicillin? Well, studies show that when you skin test these people, about 90% of the time they're wrong. So there still is a role to give penicillin in these patients. I recommend using a validated decision instrument such as the PenFast score as seen here. This identifies low-risk penicillin allergies. It's a quick 3-question clinical decision rule, and if they're low risk, then I often give them the first dose of the penicillin in the emergency department, followed by a brief observation period. Moving on to the fourth thing I want to discuss, incision and drainage. Now, any lecture about skin and soft tissue infections would not be complete without talking about abscesses, but the short answer is that all abscesses need an incision and drainage. That is the treatment of choice. Antibiotics are not always necessary. I would also advocate using a long-acting local anesthetic, and if the abscess is actually large, perform a nerve block or regional anesthesia. I wanted to mention a couple controversies that come with incision and drainage, starting with the culture. I always get an abscess culture. Now, not all groups recommend this, but there are, for one, strange bacteria out there, and two, if they bounce back, which some people do, now we know what bacteria we're fighting against and what their antibiotic susceptibilities are. Number two is packing. I trained when you're supposed to pack all abscesses that you IND. I do not pack any more. This increases pain and increases healthcare visits, but no improvement in outcomes. Antibiotics. It's not really needed, but you can slightly improve your cure rates if you give antibiotics with a number needed to treat of 14. And finally, clindamycin. It's not good anymore. It's only 70% effective for MRSA and 80% effective for strep, so I don't do it. Moving on to the fifth topic I want to discuss, disposition. How do you determine admission versus discharge? Well, it's obvious if the patient is systemically ill. Otherwise, it's just how you were trained. You look at the cellulitis and says, that's bad, I'm going to admit that. People have tried to make up different classifications, but it really isn't helpful clinically. So if you look at the textbooks, it says admission is generally required for high fever, toxic appearance, uncontrolled diabetes, significant immunosuppression, or inability to reliably take oral antibiotics. And you'll notice that's problematic because high fever, what's the definition? I'm not really sure. Toxic appearance, okay, I agree with that. Uncontrolled diabetes isn't very clear. Immunosuppression that's significant, not clear. And then sure, I agree with inability to take antibiotics. So how do I determine if a patient should be admitted versus discharged? Well, if a person has a fever or run-of-the-mill sepsis, I'll perform labs and a lactate, which is not an automatic admission. If they have severe sepsis with some end organ damage, they will be admitted, and if they have septic shock, they're obviously sick and they'll be admitted to the ICU. If they're unable to reliably take oral antibiotics due to cost or lack of insurance, I often discuss this with my pharmacist since they can often provide a 5-day prescription of antibiotics since it's cheaper to give them the antibiotics than an unreimbursed hospital stay. And then finally, what factors lead to failure of outpatient antibiotics? Well, most people think it's diabetes and CKD, which is not actually true. If you look at the studies, they came up with a DERM rule that I'm going to credit to Clay Smith, which is D stands for Diagnosis of Cellulitis in the Past Year, E is erosions or ulcers that are chronic. R is respiratory rate too fast or tachypnea. And M is a history of MRSA colonization or infection. These will have a much higher risk of leading to outpatient oral antibiotic failure. So now you've decided on a disposition, and let's first start with discharge. Again, I always give the first dose of oral antibiotics in the ED, but say you're worried about the patient but you still don't want to admit them. I often will give a higher first dose of the oral antibiotics in the emergency department based on a small study that had increased cure rates doing this, and I'll put a link to the article in the show notes. Many hospitals also have a rapid follow-up option in 2 to 3 days to evaluate, which may be a good option for you, or you could also call the patient in 1 to 2 days to see how they're doing. Or maybe you've decided to admit them. So you're going to give them IV vancomycin, right? Well, again, you don't need vancomycin unless they're sick or there's purulent cellulitis or an abscess. Otherwise, Ancef, cefazolin, is fine. I know that's amazing, but Ancef is still a great antibiotic for group A strep. Let's briefly mention vancomycin loading dose because it used to be seriously underdosed. In the past, everyone got 1 gram. That is incorrect. And the recommended dose is 15 to 20 milligrams per kilogram with a 2 gram max based on actual body weight. However, in sick patients, you actually want to give them a big loading dose, and this has been studied at 25 to 30 milligrams per kilograms with a 3 gram max. And numerous studies have looked at this, and actually multiple guidelines recommend this dose. Moving on to the sixth and final topic I want to discuss, necrotizing soft tissue infections. There are a few regimens that you can use to treat this, but we'll start with the most common one, vancomycin at a higher dose, 25 to 30 mg per kg, along with pip/tazo and clindamycin 900 milligrams to prevent exotoxin release. And calling your surgeon now, do not wait on imaging. There is a second option, which substitute linezolid for both vancomycin and clinda. Linezolid also prevents exotoxin production just like clinda, and it's the preferred protocol at our hospital. So this is linezolid 600 milligrams with pip/tazo 4.5 grams and still calling your surgeon. If you're still not convinced of the diagnosis, you can always consider using the finger test, which is performing a 2 centimeter incision over the involved tissue down to the fascia after, of course, performing local anesthesia, and observing for normal blood flow and inserting a gloved finger to test for normal tissue firmness, because sometimes the physical exam findings aren't impressive. Don't use the Larinic score, it is shown to be not good, and the CT scan has a low sensitivity but a high specificity. Of course, you can use point-of-care ultrasound for necrotizing soft tissue infection. Notice a subcutaneous gas here causing dirty air shadows. POCUS is specific for the diagnosis of necrotizing soft tissue infections. However, it is not sensitive enough to rule out the infection. Here are a few quick board review questions on situations that require different treatment, starting with a breast abscess. These are typically performed with a needle aspiration, not an incision and drainage, and often done by a breast surgeon. Animal bites, we typically use a different antibiotic, augmentin, also called dogmentin, which is amoxicillin and clavulanic acid. Freshwater exposure to the wound often requires ciprofloxacin or doxycycline to cover for Aeromonas species. In saltwater exposure, you're typically going to give doxycycline and ceftriaxone to cover for Vibrio. Another common boards question is toxic shock syndrome. This is the triad of fever, diffuse rash, and hypotension. So they should have a diffuse sunburnt type appearance. This is caused by massive cytokine release from a staph or strep infection. Interestingly, most adults have the antibodies to neutralize these toxins, but about 10% of people that don't have them. And so it causes a massive cytokine storm. The good news is that you still treat it like a necrotizing soft tissue infection with the antibiotics. And of course, you want to do source control. It's not usually caused by tampons anymore, but if there's any bandages that may be causing this, you should remove them from the patient. One final diagnosis to be aware of is staphylococcal scalded skin syndrome. This is caused by toxins that target the epidermis and therefore lead to skin desquamation and bulla formation. It looks horrible. The kiddos have a positive Nikolsky sign, meaning skin can just slough off with pressure, and it's usually in kids less than 5 years of age. However, the good point is that it does not often lead to shock since there's no massive cytokine release. So kiddos usually get admitted to the hospital for pain control, fluids, and antibiotics to cover for staph. Here are the big 5 takeaways from my lecture, starting with number 1. You have to know the difference between purulent and non-purulent cellulitis since the treatment is different. Number 2, cellulitis is a clinical diagnosis, which means you do not need labs to make the diagnosis. Number 3, know about the antibiotics cefadroxil and linezolid. We probably should be using them more than we do. Number 4, if someone is sick and getting vancomycin, the loading dose is 25 to 30 milligrams per kilogram, up to a 3-gram max. And number 5, know which antibiotics have PO and IV equivalency because it will save you a lot of time and resources in the emergency department. And that's it. Thanks for listening. If you guys have any questions, please post them in the comments below.